Hello, I wanted to talk about abusive relations and what happens during abusive relations, because abusive relations and normal relations cannot coexist, not in any situation. So an example would be if you had a boyfriend where you had been dating, 6 months, and there had been instances where you were concerned and maybe he'd been a bit controlling or demonstrated a few red flags, and then he hit you. Now, he might be sorry immediately after, and you may even go back to that relationship and pretend it didn't happen, but abusive relations have changed it. It's like corking wine. Once it's corked, the wine's undrinkable. So what's happened when he's hit you is he has asserted that he will use violence to subordinate you, because he believes that the power relations in your relationship are such. And he wants you to know this. He's hit you because he wants you to know that that is how he will end the argument and you will obey. And then once he has asserted power, he has changed the power relations in that situation. And following that point, you will always be aware that that's what he will do. This means that no other relationship can exist. Abusive relations and normal relations cannot coexist, because the minute abusive relations have occurred, the minute there has been an open attempt to subordinate using violence or abusive techniques, coercive techniques, which you can see outlined on the Deluxe wheel, that has changed the relationship. The relationship is now an abusive relationship. It's an abusive relationship the next day when he makes you breakfast to say he's sorry. It's an abusive relationship when you're at a family party and everything's fine a week later. It's an abusive relationship. Abusive relations and normal relations cannot coexist. And unless there is a significant change at the point where that has occurred, and that's not going to because those power relations have changed, it's done. The DWP at the moment cannot use any other functions at all, because people are frightened of the institution, and therefore no attempt to help somebody in an institution where people are frightened can work. Abusive relations cannot coexist. Now, the inclusion of trans and equality legislation and introductions of gender recognition certification, which should have been a straightforward process where we just, over the next few years, embedded those rights more firmly. But the moment that alignment with wider safeguarding and equality frameworks began, something occurred. And what occurred was an attempt to subordinate women. And immediately that those rights were granted, a core number of activists, backed up by academic disciplines and major institutions, which is deeply concerning, declared that they believed that the inclusion of trans inequality legislation gave a small number of males dominion over other groups and the right to subordinate them. It was immediately said that all of a sudden this meant that women's perception was now covered by law, and we were required to subordinate our perception. We were required to no longer risk assess, and we would have that removed. And then it escalated, and you had the cultures on Twitter around Jess Bradley and Ros Cavini and Sean Fay using intimidation, abuse, stalking, coercion to try and impose their will. Now, there was never a question in the UK. This was never, ever going to happen. Women's freedom of assembly was never up for grabs. The assault on Maria McLaughlin, the targeting of We Need to Talk, which has been extreme, the targeting of Women's Place UK, the targeting of specific women. This was an expression of the power relations that these activists believed existed. They did not. So all that's really happened, it's not that complicated. A safeguarding debate was requested. And when that debate started, male pattern abuse demonstrated itself, and now it's going round and round in circles, and over time it's escalated, and they've created a sealed environment on Twitter and shown how they will try and G up misogyny and violence against women and support for it, and how they will generate kind of blindness to that behaviour by demanding everybody focus on their identity. But that is done. The moment that activists like Ros Cavini, Paris Lees, Sean Fay said that trans rights equalled the right to subordinate women, the right to harm women, the right to have everybody ignore reality, risk perception, and even basic behaviour that indicates risk to manage their identity, they were stating that something had occurred. Now, this should always have been expected. The fact is that gender, the marking out of the difference between the sexes, the tangible difference is offending rates and violence and sexually predatory behaviour. And it was always very likely that the minute a door seemed to be opened, which would allow that to run free, that it would. And that should have also been expected. The end of the gender binary, which is not a binary, it's a hierarchy. A change to that gender hierarchy, which is what's happened when women have said you can no longer legally subordinate or abuse us and it's socially and legally unacceptable, was always going to result in that firm streak of abusive masculinity that seeks to harm women and harm children was going to kind of go, oh my God, what do we do? And this was always going to be the door that it tried to use. Now, that doesn't mean that all trans women are like this, but it does mean that activists like Paris Lees, Ros Cavini, Sean Fay, Jane Fay, Amy Challoner, and the associated bunch of nutcases around them saw trans rights as a way to express abusive masculinity, which has been outlawed and made legally and socially unacceptable in every other way. And this has occurred. Now, it should have been quite straightforward, it should have been expected, and with a proper consultation on the last review of the Gender Recognition Act, and with proper understanding of both safeguarding and equality legislation and the way that these frameworks interplay and develop together, this probably could have been avoided. It's largely the actions of politicians like Maria Miller, Jeremy Corbyn, you know, and the politicians in the Green Party that have done this because they were not aware of those systems. And, you know, the pattern of male pattern offending is such that this would always have been the first stage. But unfortunately, this has now grown. So all that's really happened is this core group of activists have made the gender recognition certificate utterly worthless. The attempt to use that certificate and the associated rights for trans people to gain access to children, to undermine safeguarding, to demand that women be subordinated and sex-based protections end, has revealed a risk that we were not aware of before. Now, once that risk is demonstrated in a safeguarding debate, it changes the debate because everybody has to take note of that behaviour and take it at face value. And we have to take what these activists are saying at face value. And because they are saying they are representative of trans people, and I think, you know, I think that's about as likely to be true as the elite left being representative of us people living with austerity, but this has now happened and it cannot be ignored. Now, I know it feels like UK TERFs are winning. We're not winning. We had won the minute Paris Lees, Ros Cavini, Sean Fay, etc. decided, with the support of major institutions, that trans rights meant an introduction of a new way to subordinate and abuse women. And now all that's happened is British women have been given an opportunity to demonstrate the nature of male pattern abusive behaviour and harassment. They have been given a visceral demonstration at a time when we need recognition of those systems. And this is not as much of a mess as it could be, except it is, because what's also becoming clear is that what has also happened is that organised, that paedophiles have seen to use this, and that sexually abusive males now have a bubble on Twitter, which indicates that there is serious risk. Now, the problem is that up until this point, self-ID has been the norm in this country, without a problem. And these people have now ensured that that can no longer happen. And what's going to happen is, as they realise they've lost, and they lost 2 years ago, really, there's nothing that women have done. And as women stand up and say, we can see you using violence, intimidation and abuse to subordinate and harm women and get access to children, they're going to get desperate. And they are going to escalate, because these are very mentally disordered people protecting a false identity. This is going to be a problem. This is going to put lots of us at risk. So this is a direct message about throwing women under a bus right now, and what throwing women under a bus to try and jockey for position in whatever nascent movement is forming. And it very much does seem to be forming organically. When you throw women under a bus to jockey for position, as the left have always done, in pursuit of the narcissism of purity politics, right now, you are very deliberately putting women and children at risk of very violent and sexually abusive activists. And I would urge all women involved in this to understand that that is the case here, and we can't do that. Now, we can stand up to abusive behaviour, we all know how to do it, but we need to do it without being neutralised by elite women who wish to capitalise on this situation. Now, abusive relations and normal relations cannot coexist. British TERFs are not winning the minute abusive behaviour was demonstrated by this small group of activists, and way before this campaign escalated, we had won. So I'm going to thank the violent, abusive, nuttier than squirrel shit activists who have been enjoying themselves in the last couple of years for alerting us to the risk that is evident here, for demanding a conversation about our safeguarding systems and equality frameworks, which was long overdue, by the way, thank you so much, for demonstrating intersectionality that is the recreation of violent and abusive power structures by ignoring the reality of women's existence and imposing your own identity, and for demanding this conversation. And now you need to watch how British women deal with it, and I hope we can be an example for women across the world, which I think we are, to show them how to deal with it.